Hello, everyone. Thanks for hopping on today to be part of the conversation about hate crimes. We have a couple of minutes until we get things rolling, so appreciate your patience as we wait for more folks to log in and join us today. We'll be back with you in about 2 minutes. Thanks so much. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone who's on. Thanks for joining us. We're excited that you're here. We're going to wait just about another minute to allow some more folks to join in to our conversation today. So thanks for your patience. Bear with us for about another minute or two so some more folks can log on. We'll be back with you momentarily. All right, we're 2 past the hour, so I think we're going to get rolling. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Amy Herrera. I'm a special agent with the FBI's Washington, D.C. field office, and here today to do some quick administrative announcements before we get rolling with the substance of the conversation. So I only have really 3 quick notes for you. Number 1, we are recording our conversation today so that those who can't join us will be able to access it later on. I suspect that we will have this uploaded to the HACCEN website probably in the next day or 2. I will throw the URL for the HACCEN website into the chat box so that you can see it. And you can share this recording with whoever might be interested in about a day or 2 once we get it uploaded. Second thing, we are very interested in making this a conversation. It's a conversation not only with the invited panelists, but with also all of you who would like to share thoughts or feelings or ideas about what you've experienced or what your questions might be. As we're going throughout today's conversation, you can put any of your questions in the chat box. And if you see a question there and you want to add your feedback or your thoughts, please do. The chat is open to everyone to share thoughts however they would like. So if you'd like to contribute, you are welcome to talk through chat. We might have time to also take questions from folks who raise their hands and want to ask their question verbally and not just type it in. So all questions exceedingly welcome. Third little admin thing for you to know is that we are going to ask for some input from you at the end of the webinar today. It'll be a quick poll just to capture how you thought today went. Was it useful to you? Do you think that you might be able to make use of some of the information that folks are talking about today? So yay for an end for the admin announcements. I am super excited now to turn the virtual microphone over to my friend Maya Sav at the Faith-Based ISAO to give some further opening remarks. Maya, over to you.
Thank you and welcome everyone. Most of you know me, but I'm going to introduce myself anyway. I am the Executive Director of the Faith-Based Information Sharing and Analysis Organization, commonly known as Faith-Based ISAO. So faith-based ISAO provides members with information, analysis, and capabilities to help reduce risk while enhancing preparedness, security, and resilience. We are an all-faith, all-hazard information sharing organization, and I'm responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the organization. So I do many things as part of my job, but the one thing I enjoy the most is engaging with people. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me and as I enter this session to you. Before we get into the presentation, we thought a great way to provide you with an overview of HACCEN is by way of a video that we developed. So please take a minute to watch this video. Hi, I am Maya Saab.
And I am Vicki Fishman, Director of Government and Community Relations for the Jewish Community Relations Council.
And I am Reverend Carmen Hernandez, President of the NYC LGBTQS Chamber of Commerce and Youth Community Pastor.
And I am Sharon Singh, and I am the Program Director of the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, also known as SELDEF.
And I'm Phil Froelich, Advisor to the Board of New York Metro InfraGard.
I'm Vance Taylor. I'm the Chief of the Office of Access and Functional Needs at the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services.
We are all members of HACCEN, the HACCEN Steering Committee. Thank you for joining us today so we can tell you what HACCEN is all about.
HACCEN stands for Hate Crimes Community Engagement Working Group.
It's a developing network of private and public partners. Our mission is to help raise awareness of hate crimes or incidents in our communities and to share real-time information about threats, incidents, indicators, trends, and best practice to mitigate risks associated with hate crimes.
HACCEN grew out of a series of webinars hosted by InfraGard, New York Metro, and InfraGard NHCR, the National Capital Region chapter of InfraGard, the faith-based information sharing and analysis organization, the InfraGard Religious Facilities Protection Program, and the FBI Washington Field Office.
The series of webinars included information on hate crimes and bias incidents, a guide for understanding, an overview of hate crimes, a case presentation, and a community conversation panel.
During the community conversation panel portion, the panelists shared information about hate incidents that their respective communities have experienced. There are many similarities in what the various participating community groups experienced. And there are also quite a few differences in how the various communities address rising hate incidents.
The community conversation panel discussion went so well. We all felt that there was a lot more to say about us and to learn from each other. Out of that was born HACCEN.
HACCEN conversations will be hosted on a list server. That means a HACCEN member can send an email to instantly share with all HACCEN members information about hate crimes, including indicators of possible incidents and best practices for mitigation. On the HACCEN list server, members can start a discussion and respond to discussions. That's really powerful.
HACCEN will be piloted in the DC and New York Metro for a little while and will then be expanded nationally in a phased approach.
To join HACCEN, you simply need to tell us a little bit about yourself and your motivation for joining HACCEN. The HACCEN application is hosted on a secure server and information provided by way of an application is secure.
This initiative and this group, the steering committee of HACCEN, are vested in the need to contribute to finding ways to mitigate hate incidents for all. We don't and won't have all the answers, but we are committed to bringing people together to talk about it.
Thanks for your attention. If you have any questions, send us an email. The address is infragardncr@gmail.com.
Hi, it's Maya again. Thank you for taking the time to listen to some of the members of the HACCEN Steering Committee as we introduced HACCEN to you. I hope that you will join us on the platform real soon. So thanks for watching through that. We have someone who was on the video on our panel today, Vance Taylor. He'll be talking in just a moment. Today, we will discuss hate crimes and incidents motivated by bias against sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or disability. So I have a personal interest in this topic as my daughter was born with cerebral palsy, and I would be horrified and heartbroken if she is ever subjected to bias or hate speech due to her disability. I raised her to think of herself as a woman with many abilities despite her disability, and I want the world to see her and treat her that same way. So let's get started, shall we? So Michael Bigsby will kick us off. Michael is an FBI intelligence analyst. After completing his basic field training course in 2019, Michael was assigned to Public Corruption Civil Rights Intelligence Unit, now known as the Civil and Human Rights Intelligence Unit, with the Criminal Investigation Division covering civil rights violations. Prior to joining the Bureau, Mike worked for the Department of Defense as an Army civilian and he spent multiple years working a human resource specialist and an equal employment opportunity specialist at Fort Belvoir. So Mike, over to you.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
No problem. So thank you again, Maya. How's everyone doing this afternoon, morning, I guess, depending on if you're on the East Coast or West Coast. I think majority on the East Coast, but just wanted to say my greetings to you. Again, like Maya said, I'm an IA here with the FBI. Been working in the Civil Rights Unit for approximately almost 3 years now, coming up, with the emphasis on focus on hate crimes and other civil rights violations. The big key here we're going to talk about is, hate crimes from the perspective, obviously from not only the federal perspective, but the public view and the state, local law enforcement perspective, but also with that's going to counter with our uniform crime reporting program, which I will get into here in a second. So you might ask, what is a hate crime? For those who don't know, a hate crime is a crime against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against a characteristic of the victim or the property. So in simple terms, it's a crime motivated by bias, motivated by an offender's bias. What are those characteristics? The characteristics are those things that are classified as a protected class. So you have your race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and national origin. Just to name a few. How do we collect all this information? How do we gather this information? How do we analyze it? How do we share this information? What's great is I put it in the chat. There's this program called the Uniform Crime Reporting that the FBI runs and is housed out of the Criminal Justice Information Services Division. With this program, state, local, tribal, and federal law enforcement departments are allowed access to not only participate in this initiative in this program, but allowed to submit hate crime reporting within this program. What's important to note from the UCR program, I use UCR for short, so I don't have to keep saying Uniform Crime Reporting. What is important to note is that for state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies, they are not mandated to report. So it's completely voluntary for for the excuse me, for state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies to report. As far as federal reporting, it is a mandated requirement that they report to the uniform crime data. So again, I attached a link within the chat box. So if you have some opportunity to dive through the data, this data can be interpreted in a multitude of different ways. Obviously, today we're going to talk more so on the gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability aspect of this. In totality, there was roughly 8,263 reported incidents that occurred in 2020, and 2020 is going to be our latest data. The data for 2021 is set to be released later this year, usually around in the fall time frame. So that updated information is coming. So I am going based off the 2020 data, but the 2020 data and the stuff we've seen previously, we see a trend. So I'm gonna go into those trends here. But overall, there was 8,263 total incidents reported. So that's your incidents that were single bias related incidents. So if the person was being targeted because of race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, gender identity, those all can be broken down into specific to what the bias motivation was. But there also is another bias motivation of multiple bias incidents. So for instance, if there was an incident that occurred against someone that was targeting someone because of their race and their disability, that would be grouped into the multiple bias incidents. So again, I'm gonna be talking a little bit on both of the total number of incidents and the single bias incidents. So hopefully I don't sound confusing. And again, this information is publicly available for you all to access. As far as the incidents have occurred, there's been an increase from 13% from 2019 to 2020, and then an increase of 35% from 2016 to 2020. So, and going back 10 years from 2011, there's been a 33% increase in hate crime reporting. Again, these reporting numbers are all voluntary for state, local, and tribal partners, fairly mandated mandated for federal law enforcement agencies to report. What's also important to note, just because a law enforcement agency participates or is categorized as participating in the UCR program, not all law enforcement agencies report. So, for instance, we had roughly 15,138 law enforcement agencies that participated in the UCR data collection. Um, and of that number, we only had roughly 2,300 agencies actually submit information for the UCR data. So, but you'll see as I get into some of the data, like even though there were not quote unquote all the law enforcement agencies reported, there still has been a significant number of incidents reported. Um, as far as incidents against the sexual orientation, gender and gender identity, and disability bias, you might ask, what is the bias motivation? Like, who are the targets? What are the victim types? So the victim types is what the UCR categorizes it as. So as again, this information you can see. I have a breakdown, a little bit of information. I don't want to misconstrue any of the numbers, so I'll read a few of these numbers off for you. So the victim type is majority individuals. There is some victims. When I say victims, there are some victims or property damage that occurred against businesses or financial institutions or government facilities. But the majority are going to be individuals when it comes to this particular bias. As far as where they are occurring, so where are these incidents happening at? A lot are happening in the public eye. So between your highways, your roads, alleyways, a lot have occurred in residences or homes, parks, playgrounds, restaurants, bars and nightclubs, schools, and even office buildings. So it's not that these incidents are not occurring in the public eye. It's these incidents are occurring in the public eye, in public places for the most part, based on our 2020 stats. Um, what are the offense types, or what are the actual type? What are the types of incidents that are occurring? Um, when it comes to the crimes that are occurring against persons or people, we have the majority of these incidents are either some type of assault or intimidation. So when we say intimidation, those are going to be your threats. Those are going to be your, things that occur, on like social media or different platforms that are trying to intimidate the community in order to, just in order for them not to, for whatever reason, that's their bias. So intimidation and assaults are going to be your top two incidents when it comes to crimes against persons. As far as crimes against property, and the majority, and these kind of all correlate with each other, and which I'll get into. So your thefts, your robberies, your burglaries are going to be sort of at your top. Also, lots of acts of vandalism. when I say these robberies, burglaries, and intimidation assaults kind of coincide with each other, and I mentioned this earlier, some of these incidents seem to occur or start on social media platforms, whether they're Facebook, YouTube. I think there's a couple apps. There's Grinder. A lot of these incidents are well, not a lot. I'm not going to say a lot, but there's a bulk of these incidents that are occurring that are stimulating from these social media platforms that then lead to in-person incidences or assaults, and even in some cases homicides and deaths. So just a little bit of being on situational awareness on what's occurring on these social media platforms too. So again, that was the type of offense. When you're looking at who's committing the acts of crimes, the known offenders, their race and ethnicity, um, majority are white or Caucasian, Black or African American, and when you're looking at what other ethnicities, a lot of them are unknown actually. It's just, and that could be based on the information that, excuse me, the state or local or the law enforcement agency has received based on the information they have on the when they reported the information to the UCR collection type. Another another highlight or per se is who are the victims? Are a lot of the victims occurring against adults or males or juveniles? The majority have occurred against, again, based on this UCR data, against um, adults. Sorry about that, adults. Juvenile victims, they made up about roughly 109 victims that occurred when it comes to single bias incidents. So again, the majority of the victims are adults, and that's again, this is just highlighting the UCR data, which is publicly available information, and which I included into the chat box. This these numbers can You can look at these numbers, you can look at the locations, you can look at a lot of different aspects of the UCR data in a variety of different methods. If I'm speaking on the numbers that specifically on single bias incidents against the gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability bias, there were roughly 1,751 incidents reported in 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 2020, and that 1,751 is of single bias incidents. So that's of 8,052 incidents. So when it comes to the UCR data or just the reporting, the information received, race, national origin, ethnicity, those you usually see a lot more incidents related in that realm. You see a lot of incidents related in the religion realm, but it seems like you're starting to see an uptick of the incidents occurring against the gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability bias. Um, when you're looking at the single bias categories, again, the race is going to be um, sort of at the top, so accounting for roughly 65% of the incidents. Then you got your gender identity, sexual orientation bias is accounting for roughly 18%. And I just want to highlight that because over the last few years, sexual orientation wasn't the second highest reporting based on hate crime numbers. It was usually, again, I was saying religious bias, but now you're starting to see like more reporting from the not only the LGBTQ community, but from our state, local, and federal partners regarding sexual orientation, disability, and gender identity bias. So just
Mike,
wanted to
thanks
highlight
so much
that.
for, yes, thank you so much for that overview. And I know that
No
there's
problem.
never enough time to get through everything. I know that you could dive even further into the uniform crime reports, but I do want, based on the information that you've shared about what the FBI is receiving through voluntary reporting, I wanted to be able to contrast that based on the experiences of our panelists and kind of what data they're seeing, what experiences they're hearing about from their communities. So I'm going to ask you to pause momentarily there, and we're going to switch the conversation over to each of our panelists in turn to let them give their perspective on what sorts of hate incidents or hate crimes has their community been experiencing in the past couple of years, and what's the community been doing to try and fight hate incidents. So our first panelist who's going to cover those two topics is Van Vance Taylor. So L. Vance Taylor comes to us as Chief of the Office of Access and Functional Needs at the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. He has worked in the DC area as an advisor for 2 members of Congress. He directed security policy at a National Water Association, and he's been a principal at a top-ranked Homeland Security and emergency management consulting firm. Vance was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy as a child and uses a power wheelchair. He's a nationally recognized public speaker and advocate for individuals with disabilities. Vance, over to you for your initial comments.
Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it. I appreciate everybody being here today. I know that this is a difficult topic, right? I mean, we're talking about things that are truly horrible. And we tend to shy away from those discussions because they're very uncomfortable. These are things we don't like to think about. But the reality is, unless we talk about it, unless we recognize that hate crimes exist and that certain populations are specifically targeted, we can't fully understand and therefore address the issue. And so I want to thank everybody for being here and being willing to be part of a difficult conversation. In terms of the hate incidents that individuals with disabilities have experienced in the past year or two, we've seen a real uptick in the number of incidents. And I would say the scope and scale as well. But we've seen everything from attacks on public transit, where people are pulled from their wheelchairs, to people being beaten outside on the street with assistive devices such as canes or crutches. We've also seen the theft of assistive technology. So where you have somebody that uses, let's say, an iPad, for example, to communicate, that device has been taken, and as it was taken, comments were made specifically referencing what that loss meant to the individual. And where we've seen a lot of incidents, and this is where maybe I think hate crimes when it comes to individuals with disabilities probably differs a little bit from maybe other hate crimes, right? That there are some unique characteristics that differentiate them, is that a lot of the hate crimes that occur are committed repeatedly over the years. And many of the individuals that are involved that are perpetrating these hate crimes are actually close to the victims. And so one of the areas that we've seen a big uptick is in the amount of hate crimes that are occurring both in care facilities and institutions by people that are placed in trusted positions, and also in homes. And the pandemic has been presented a real challenge in that particular area, especially when everybody was kind of hunkered down, because what you had was essentially individuals at highest risk, many of whom had disabilities, hunkered down at homes or facilities, and the level of vulnerability that they had not only increased, but their ability to ask for help decreased as their support networks were limited. And so, those are things that we've seen in the past year or two. One of the areas that we've tried to address in order to lessen some of these incidents or hate crimes has been both to empower individuals with disabilities to understand, one, what's a hate crime, how to report a hate crime, what do I do if I'm the victim of a hate crime, and then also to hold agencies responsible, not just for enforcing the laws and taking action when they see something, but also for ensuring that individuals that work, particularly in home health environments, are trained, screened, and observed and held to account for the actions that they have and the things that are taking place in these trusted environments. So that's sort of what we're seeing. That's how we're trying to address it. And I'll turn it back over to you. Amy, we can hear from others and happy to engage on some specifics.
Thank you, Vance. What a great amount of insight in just a few minutes. Wow. I'm going to introduce Amy Canova next, who comes to us as Program Manager for Safe Space Nova. She's a certified school psychologist and a longtime advocate for LGBTQ youth in Northern Virginia. So Amy, same questions to you. What are you seeing in the community? How common are incidents and crimes involving hate? And how is the community trying to respond to this?
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I have to echo something Vance said, and it's in regards to how the pandemic affected our LGBTQ youth population. While they weren't necessarily requiring physical care, many of them were isolated from school communities, which provided school support and affirmation and access to GSAs. And I think a lot of incidents of hate are not classified as hate crimes against the LGBTQ community, in part because I think there's significant underreporting. I think youth are hesitant to report and often discouraged from doing so. And as Vance mentioned, often the perpetrator is a family member or someone close to the victim. And it's incidents of hate that are hurting our young people. In terms of things I've seen in this area, I would say that I've seen an uptick in the number of adults in the community who seek me out, knowing I've worked with HACCEN and the Civil Rights Division of the FBI. And some of those hate crimes have been with regard to discrimination in housing and in employment, where LGBTQ adults have been picked up an application for housing and had all their paperwork in order. And then when they showed up with their same gender partner, all of a sudden there's problems and there's reasons that they can't move in. And rarely is someone specifically told you can't move in because you're gay or because you're trans, but there was no other reason for disallowing their residency. We've seen hate crimes reported in the district in which people are going about their day-to-day lives, and especially our trans women of color in DC that have been victims of violent hate crimes just for being who they are. There is a higher percentage of trans women in DC that engage in sex work occupations, and that often puts them at risk for hate crimes going about their day-to-day life and employment. In terms of young people in the school setting, I think that there are hate crimes that are coded as discrimination or bullying, when the reality is they meet the standards for hate crime under the law. But as a school district, I think sometimes schools are hesitant to label such as a hate crime, in part because hate crimes appropriately have an extremely negative connotation, but I think there is a unwillingness to label things because then it changes how it's dealt with. So in terms of the things we're seeing in school, we're seeing kids that are called derogatory names based on their transgender or gender diverse status, or we've seen students that are discriminately penalized for public displays of affection because they're with the same gender partner. Other things that we've seen in terms of hate crimes, again, are generally coded as discrimination or bullying or general misconduct. Are teachers refusing to honor a student's name and pronouns in the classroom, which causes significant dysphoria and academic deficiencies, as well as reduced attendance. And then I think the biggest group in terms of percentage that we've seen are students that are school avoidant or school refusal students that are LGBTQIA, who don't feel safe going to school because of incidents of bullying systemically throughout the years, so that they either enroll in virtual learning or in private schools or are homeschooled. And so I think in many ways, things go unreported because the students that are the greatest victims just disappear from people's radar. And unfortunately, what we know through research is victimization begets victimization. So those who have been victimized are more likely to be victimized again. And so I think that underlies the importance and the need for restorative practices and rebuilding of community members that have been hurt.
Wow, that's a great overview of a lot of issues. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do as a society to figure out how to lessen hate overall. Jill, I want to give the virtual mic over to you next for your perspective. Jill Davidson comes to us as a nationally certified school psychologist in the North Kitsap High School in Washington State. She transitioned genders in 2010 while working as a school psychologist in Seattle. She has facilitated support groups for transgender adults and has made presentations on how to make schools safe for transgender youth. Jill, over to you for your initial thoughts.
Hi, everybody. And again, thank you for being here. Really glad that you're addressing this topic today. And I'm really glad for what all you do to keep us safe. I'm going to probably build on some of what Amy has just said. So there's a couple of things. I'm kind of glad for Mike's review of the definition of hate crimes, because I think there's a tendency within the trans community to kind of minimize more minor bias incidents. We tend to be focused on the most violent incidents that happen to us, because obviously we're all afraid of that. And also there's one thing I'll bring up too, is that some of our characteristics that might make us the victim of a hate crime are more or less visible, or we can make more or less visible. My family is Jewish, and my daughter can wear her star most places. She can also choose not to wear it. Of course, that in itself is kind of a self crime if you hide who you are, but it's possible to do that. For a lot of trans people, once they transition, if they more or less blend into the community as maybe a cisgender person who doesn't look trans, they tend to leave the trans community behind, and they don't want to think about those incidents anymore. So there can be a lot of denial. The pandemic has been pretty devastating to our community, because a lot of our support groups, for example, that used to meet in person, try to meet virtually, and then there's problems with Zoom and other platforms in terms of being open enough to potentially new members of support groups and yet not be Zoom bombed. We have a lot of trans and queer youth here in the area that I serve, Kitsap County, west of Seattle. It's kind of a mixed suburban rural area, and there's a lot of gay and trans youth who are living very isolated experiences. We lost about 10% of our enrollment last year. Kids who were not able to connect. We've only gained back about 2% of that 10% that we lost. And so we are quite concerned about the isolation that many of our youth are experiencing, as well as adults. Each year we commemorate the number of trans people who've been lost in the previous year to homicide. And I'm going to share my screen here a second. It says the host is disabled, participant screen sharing. Each year.
You can do it now.
I can do it now. Okay, thank you. I should know how to use Zoom by now, but let's see, share screen. Here we are. These are numbers of trans people who've been reported in the press as having been murdered each year. And each year we read those names on November 20th. There's a number of ceremonies in many cities around the United States and around the world, really. But these are the number of trans persons who have been murdered, at least as the press reports them, each year. And you can see there's been quite an increase. So we were around 12 people we were commemorating in 2012, and we're up to about 48 last year. So the hate crimes have been increasing. This, of course, is the extreme of hate, and not every incident was this necessarily motivated by hate. One of the persons who lost her life in 2021, or lost their life, was actually in Seattle and was in a Black Lives Matter march that had shut down Interstate 5 through downtown, and someone drove their truck through the barricades and right into the crowd, and she was one of the people who was killed. That was motivated by hate, not necessarily against trans people, but motivated against the people who were marching. Anyway, I think my time is getting close to the end, and I I don't want to start repeating myself. I know that those of you are going to have some questions later that we can answer.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Jill. And I know there's never enough time for everyone to get through all of the things that they want to share. But what I do want to get to are the questions that those of you who registered to come today, specifically wanted to ask. We wanted to learn particular things. And so the questions for the panel that all of our panelists will be chiming in on come from you, the questions that you submitted to us up front. So the first question, Jill, is going to come right back to you, which is a biggie overall. How can we combat or prevent hate overall, including the kinds of incidents that don't include physical violence, but are still traumatic nonetheless? So Jill, you're up first with that one.
Thinking about, that's a big question, obviously. And I tend to try to think systematically about these things. I think there are some long-term things that can be really powerful, but they're long-term. There's some intermediate things when hate incidents have happened, and then there's kind of acute short-term things. Long-term, we've had a long history. There's a long literature in social psychology that reducing hate depends on intergroup contact, that the more people can get to know people in that minoritized group, especially engage with them, especially in ways that they depend on them, that can reduce hateful feelings over time. And I take that to mean to be very visible in my community. Harvey Milk in San Francisco said years ago, come out wherever you are. It's a moral imperative for those of us in those minoritized communities to be out and visible to people so that people can get to know us. I am the transgender people you all can see today. And you're getting to know me little by little. There have been efforts in some communities like the Not in Our Town movement, where people can open up to having dinner or lunch with someone who is from another perspective on things. And it's really hard to hate someone who buys you lunch. So speak when appropriate, join community organizations like the Lions Club, educate at all opportunities. I write letters to the editor, or I used to. There aren't so many letters anymore, but whenever possible, I try to write letters to people, oftentimes countering misbeliefs. One of the beliefs that we deal with here, when people talk about hate crimes, there's a certain segment of the community that says, well, that's just the thought police, right? You're just calling things hate crimes because you don't agree. And you're going to try to police the way we think. They don't really have absorbed that idea that this is violence against persons or property that is damaging. Intermediate term, we try to build safety awareness within our community. When I first transitioned, my wife was horrified that I would get in the car without making sure all the doors were locked, and horrified that I would try to go out running after sundown. It just didn't occur to me. And yet she was raised with that as a woman. And there's a lot of that kind of training that we need to do within our community. Some of our support groups have invited in self-defense coursework so that they can be more aware of their surroundings, because 90% of self-defense, right, is like prevention and being safe. One of the things that's maybe unique to the trans community is that when we first go out, when we're first transitioning, is we're kind of highly embarrassed about how we look. especially if we transition later in life. And so when I was first going out in the community and walking around, even with trans friends, my tendency was to go to the darkest place possible, fewest people possible, which is the opposite of what I would really need to stay safe. So there are particular risks, I think, for some of the people in our communities. Again, in the intermediate term, educating our general community, people outside of our minoritized communities, about threats against us. So I have really mixed feelings about this, but some of my, I don't know, compatriots try to open up the Transgender Day of Remembrance, November 20th, to non-trans people. And I have this emotional reaction to that of not being very comfortable around non-trans people on the Transgender Day of Remembrance, just because I kind of want us to kind of be with ourselves. And yet I know that educational process is really important. And then acute short-term responses, just first aid training, knowing who to call to report hate crimes, education of potential victims. I have to say, as we've been talking, it's occurred to me, I've had about 4 incidents of hate against me. I tend not to think of them as incidents of hate because nobody ever attacked me physically or attacked my property, but said things. Or I had one person who was later arrested for this, who sent me hate letters under a pseudonym, Texas Mama. And these were horrible letters, and I don't, we showed it to the police person who was serving as our student resource officer, and he said, "This is a bias incident." But it was just part of life, right? And kind of amusing to me in some ways. So there's a tendency for us to downplay some of the more minor incidents because we have to go on living our lives. And I don't know if that applies to some of the other communities, but I know it does to me as a trans person.
Thank you for sharing both your personal experiences and kind of what you're seeing and hearing among others in the community. Vance, I know that you had some thoughts too that you wanted to share on this particular topic. That how do we combat hate overall? What are your thoughts about that, sir?
Yeah, no, good question. And Jill, thanks for your comments there and for being vulnerable. And I think that's part of what we have to do, right? We have to have the discussion. We have to talk about it. And it's interesting because I think about, we want to live in a world that's peaceful, and yet many of us don't experience peace within our own lives, right? So it's sort of that, you have to be the change, but there really is something to it. I recognize that as somebody with a disability, it's important for me to have whatever influence I can, wherever I can, in the lives of the people around me, because so many of the people that I interact with, their only point of reference is somebody with a disability. Might be something they've seen on TV or social media, as opposed to an actual individual with a disability. And what I found is that when you personalize something, right, it's the most effective way to reverse or to humanize, right? Hate crimes are largely dependent on people's ability to dehumanize someone else, right? You're not a person, you're someone with a disability. You're not a person, you're somebody from the LGBTQ community, right? But Jill said, it's hard to hate someone that buys you lunch. I've heard, Brene Brown, I think, says it's hard to hate people up close, right? As we get to know individuals from these different communities, suddenly it becomes very personal to us, not just so that we're more aware of our own behaviors, but so that we become very aware of their struggles and we become very aware of the behaviors of others, right, as they interact with those communities. So I think that's important that we do that. I also think that we have to, as individuals, and then collectively as a society, we have to remove the shame that's associated with things like abuse and vulnerability, and I'll say disability, right? That there are so many negative feelings of shame where individuals who experience abuse or the victims of hate crimes somehow turn inward as if to ask, what did I do wrong? Or don't feel that they can come forward and report what's happened. And we have to change that. We have to teach people that coming forward is actually a way of taking control and being empowered and taking a stand, and that should be celebrated and applauded. And that's something we need to teach one another, and again, all those that we have influence over. And then lastly, I think we just need to find a community, right? We talk about communities, but to really think about what that is, we all need support networks. We all need people we can rely on and depend on and look to for strength and support. And we have to actively seek out our community and develop it and expand it and be welcoming, so that we have a place of refuge and a place of resource. There are so many times in my own life when it's been until I was in a community with friends who had disabilities that I learned about so many of these things, right? What dangers are out there, what opportunities are out there, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of everyone's collective experiences. And I could have never learned those things if I was only around my non-disabled friends and family and people in my life. And so we have to find our communities. And all of those things, right? We take a lot of bites at that apple. And I think that's how we affect and create a cultural change that ultimately leads to a reduction in hate crimes and intolerance for hate crimes, and leads to an increase in accountability for those responsible for those incidents and hate crimes. And that's when we, I think, just get to a better place overall.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack, and I'm suddenly wishing that we had planned 2 hours for our webinar instead of 1, because there's so much that we could dive further into. Amy C., I wanted to toss one of the questions to you as well, and that this gets a little bit more personal, same theme. How can I, as a person, as an individual, get involved in preventing or mitigating hate crimes? The I being anyone, right, who's listening in
Absolutely.
today.
So I think a big first step is recognizing that they exist. Also helping to reduce barriers to report. But then also, or thirdly, I want to say there's a framework called the addressing framework that helps one to recognize their bias and privilege. And anytime you have a group that has more people in it and therefore more power, there is an inherent privilege associated with that. And that creates a dichotomy of power. And when you're talking about hate crimes occur against those that are least in power. And so one of the ways to mitigate is to empower others by also recognizing unearned bias and privilege that is inherent in many of us. There's an organization called, it used to be called Teaching Tolerance, but the reality is no one wants to just be tolerated, and nor should they be. They should be appreciated and valued. And so they're now learning for justice, I believe. And that is really what this is all about, is helping to educate and reach people at a human, individual, connecting level, because I think a lot of hate crimes come from a place of fear and ignorance. And both of those things are learned behaviors. And so beginning with very young children, we can be teaching them about appreciation of differences and diversity, not just acceptance. You know, no one wants to be tolerated. No one should have to settle for being tolerated. And I have a friend who has a tattoo on her arm that says, "Your silence will not protect you." And I think it's important to remember, just as Jill had said, early in her transition, she would go into what was the riskiest places by being in the dark for fear of how she would be perceived and the encounter she would experience. But I don't think people should have to have their voices silenced, and they should have to be unseen in order to feel safe. And I think psychological safety and physical safety are basic human rights. And if we recognize the basic human rights and dignity of humanity, it will mitigate hate.
Wow, such powerful comments from all of you and such great, huge things that we can all work towards. I am astonished to say that our time together is almost already at an end. There are many questions that we did not even touch that those of you who registered to join us today had submitted for consideration. So I'm going to share many of those through the HACCEN listserver as a way of continuing this conversation. First, though, I want to give each of our speakers one chance to pass on one thing that they hope that you can take away from the conversation today, as short as it was. Mike, you're up first. What's the one thing you'd like folks to take away from today's conversation?
Just want to highlight that again, the UCR information is publicly available, so you can view that information, interpret that information in a variety of different ways. I provided the FBI contact information in the chat, so you can contact your nearest field office. Obviously, I think the first reaction is to call 911 and things like that. So that's obviously that isn't a way to contact information, report hate crimes, but also just wanted to provide the tip line and the number and the FBI field office information in the chat there. I just also want to just highlight one quick thing regarding a hate crime versus a hate incident. There's a little bit of a difference between First Amendment protected speech and an actual hate crime. So if something involves like a true threat, such as physical threat, verbal threat, phone threat, telephone, variety of different threats that actually intend to harm or hurt an individual. That's going to be that can be a potential hate crime versus your First Amendment protected speech, such as, for example, if I say I hate apples, that's not going to be necessarily a hate crime. But if I say I want to kill apples, that's when you start to get into your hate crime lane. So just a little bit of a difference there. I hope everyone can relay that information too. So thank you for everything.
Thank you for that, Mike. Great reminders. And Vance, before I turn over to you for a quick final comment, I will give a heads up that that's one of the topics that the HACCEN Steering Committee is looking at hosting a webinar on, is hearing from prosecutors, federal and local, about what's prosecutable as a hate crime based on statutes. But Vance, first over to you, sir, for your final comment that you'd like folks to take away from.
Yeah, I think just, so many times we think of hate crimes in terms of what we see on the national news, and we don't recognize or appreciate that the hate crime, it happens everywhere locally, and usually it's not going to be on the news. So we just have to be aware of that and understand it, and let's broaden our perspective, right? Let's see today what we didn't see yesterday. Let's be aware and decide that we're going to proactively be a force for good and empowerment in this area. We each do what we can, right? I can be aware, I can help when it's needed, I can report when I see something, I can understand that we each have a role to play when it comes to spreading peace and knowledge and goodwill in the world. And we can do that individually and have a change collectively.
Beautifully said. Thank you for sharing that. Amy C., I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to you next. What would you like attendees to take away from today's conversation?
I echo tremendously what Vance said. And I think there's this tendency to feel that we can't change a system, but the reality is a system change begins with one individual. And hate is learned at home and it can be unlearned at home. And we can teach appreciation for differences and diversity, and having a capacity and a drive and a motivation to understand what we once did not. Because education, I think, is the key to a lot of reduced incidents of victimization. I think we should advocate for DEI task forces at our police level, because I think things don't rise to the threshold of the attention of the FBI because people think to call 911. And if the person on the other end of the phone taking that call is not trained in diversity and equity and inclusion, it might stop there. And then I think as individuals, we can't afford to be wallflowers. We can't afford to sit back and do nothing. And so in the DC area, if you ride the metro, they say, see something, say something, do something. And so I think it's important that we empower people to take action, because the price of having privilege is the duty to use that privilege for good and to help people that are being discriminated against for lacking privilege.
Thank you for that, Amy. Beautifully said, so eloquent. Jill, over to you, ma'am, for your final comments. What would you like attendees to take away from today?
I would love to give you just a really short thing, but considering who I'm speaking to, Amy made a reference earlier to a number of trans people who have worked in the sex trade. And I think it's really important to understand the pathway that many of our youth go and why they oftentimes wind up working in that. I've had trans people who will not go to a Transgender Day of Remembrance event because certain people worked in the sex trade and were murdered in that. Many of our youth, primarily youth of color, are pushed out of their homes when they come out, have to live on the streets. They're pushed out of school early, don't have a degree. They engage in survival sex in order to have a roof over their head, to make some amount of money. Many are saving for transition-related medical care, and it's been slow state by state trying to get transition-related medical care covered by insurance, but many states do now cover that. I just wanted to say that so that if you are involved in investigating a crime where the victim was a sex worker, not to be dismissive of that, because there's a whole history before they were involved in the sex trade. And I know that you're probably not dismissive of it. We have had, I think, much better response from police and investigatory agencies over the last few years. It used to be that these murders of trans women were dismissed and no investigation started, no culprit identified, perpetrator identified, no trials. That has changed in the last 6 to 8 years or so, and we're grateful for that.
Thank you for that great reminder. Wow, to all of our speakers today, you've all shared such very personal things. And as all of you have said, these are hard conversations to have. We're grateful that you were here to share your thoughts with us. Maya, I turn things back over to you for a wrap up.
Well, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. And thank you to the panelists who participated in today's webinar, Vance Taylor, Amy Canova, and Jill Davidson. And of course, thanks to Amy Herrera for moderating this session. Please take a minute to participate in our poll. We want your feedback. We want to make our programs valuable to you. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll right now, and I'll give you a chance to tackle that while I continue to close today's session. If you are a victim or think you are a victim of a hate crime, we encourage you to report to law enforcement, but we hope that you will also report hate incidents on HACCEN. HACCEN's membership includes folks from the FBI like Amy and folks with the Department of Justice as well. I hope that by way of today's presentation, we have inspired you to join HACCEN. I received feedback last week, actually, that I may have let folks leave with the impression that one must belong to a faith-based organization to join HACCEN. Well, you don't. You can be a member of InfraGard or belong to an organization that has a demonstrated interest in mitigating hate incidents. So please go on the website, complete an application, and join us. And let's continue this conversation. There is so much that we can do together on mitigating hate. For me, that could mean that my most precious daughter may feel more safe and secure so she can thrive in a world where she is not the target of hate. So thanks again, and I bid you the rest of the day.